Have you ever been on an airplane and looked out the window and looked down at the landscape and all the tiny representations of buildings and cars and everything and thought, what would it be like to jump out of a moving airplane and skydive? Well, there was a very famous criminal who did just that. If you don't know who he is, stick around. We're going to talk about him, and we're going to talk about that investigation, which is arguably one of the more interesting cases in law enforcement history. The captain has turned on the seatbelt sign, so buckle up and stand by. It's Nothing But the Truth. I'm your host, Ramesh Nyberg, former homicide detective, current teacher and law enforcement trainer, and future world traveler. This is a nonpartisan, non-political, non-BS space where communication is cherished and no punches are pulled. If investigation in criminal justice is your thing and you like hearing things from maybe a different angle every so often, this is where you belong. Climb aboard. Climb aboard indeed. That's what Dan Cooper did on November 24th, 1971 in Portland, Oregon. The plane was headed for Seattle, and what took place after that became American legend, the stuff of folklore, but it's all true. Now, what today's episode is really about, more than the story of D.B. Cooper, is it's about technology, and it's about technology in law enforcement. For those of you who don't know the story, basically, a guy named Dan Cooper bought a ticket for this flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle. And during the flight, he got the attention of one of the flight attendants and gave her a note. It basically said that he had a bomb and he was going to blow up the plane if his demands weren't met. So she sat down beside him at his direction, and he calmly explained to her what to do. He wanted the plane to land at Seattle, and when the plane landed, he wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes to be delivered to him on the airplane. This was arranged through Northwest Orient Airlines, and when they landed, they did indeed bring $200,000 in cash and, as instructed, 4 parachutes onto the plane. At this point, he allowed the passengers to disembark. The passengers had no idea that they had been hijacked until they got off the airplane and were told about the incident. They thought there were mechanical difficulties, and that is why they had to circle the airport for 2 hours. In reality, this delayed landing was so that they could arrange for Cooper's demands to be met. Now, after the plane took off again, at Cooper's direction, he said he wanted to be flown to Mexico. He had the rest of the flight crew go up into the cockpit with the pilot, and he was left alone in the back of the airplane. Somewhere near the Oregon and California line, the pilots noticed that the aft air stair, which was a stairway descending from the back of the airplane, had been opened. They asked on the intercom, they asked Cooper if he needed any assistance. He replied with one word, no. And after a couple of minutes, they went back to see what was going on, and Cooper was gone. After the plane landed, authorities searched the aircraft and confirmed that Cooper was indeed gone and had parachuted out of the airplane. No one knew whether he had done so successfully or not. In fact, to this day, no one can really confirm if D.B. Cooper made it to the ground alive. It's important to note here that he left a couple of items on board. He left 2 of the 4 parachutes, and he also left a clip-on tie that he had been wearing. Interesting to note that 8 years later, after this incident, a family was camping on the Columbia River and found some cash, some old currency that was deteriorating and was in the sand. They turned it over to the FBI, and the FBI was able to confirm that this was part of the money that was delivered to Cooper 8 years before. Now, that doesn't help us really determine for sure whether he made it to the ground alive or not, but it is an interesting side note to the story. Investigators were able to determine that the river washed the money ashore into that area rather than it being buried. We're going to talk a little bit more about those items in just a minute. First, I want to tell you about Buzzsprout. Yeah, this is an advertisement of sorts. Buzzsprout is the reason why you're listening to this podcast. It's a podcast platform that I found when I first started looking into doing this podcast. And I tell you, it's so ridiculously easy to use and very supportive of their customers. And I would recommend that if you are interested in doing a podcast, look into Buzzsprout. Check them out at buzzsprout.com, B-U-Z-Z, and then the word sprout, just like a little bean sprout, and you'll be on your way to. I am not someone who is technologically savvy. I can get around pretty well, but if I can use Buzzsprout without ever having to call their tech support people, then anybody can. Buzzsprout.com, check it out. As you can imagine, a huge search was underway, encompassing several law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, the Oregon and California State Police, helicopters from the military. Everybody was involved in trying to find this mysterious man who had jumped from the airplane. Now, you're probably wondering, I mentioned his name was Dan Cooper. That's the name he used to purchase the ticket. How did it become D.B. Cooper? Well, from what I've read and heard, this was simply a mistake in translating something that happened in a news media report. Somebody referred to him as DB for some whatever reason, and that just stuck. And that name has followed this investigation around since day one. There have been numerous suspects that have been looked into, investigated, questioned. Their background has been picked apart with a fine-tooth comb. Many of them were military veterans, Vietnam paratroopers and whatnot, people with the type of experience and that would lend itself to somebody having the confidence to ask for parachutes, be able to understand how to use them, and have the savvy to jump out of an airplane and survive, we think. It is altogether possible that he landed somewhere that is not yet a death site, as it were. But in absence of that, it's also reasonable to assume he got away and is the mastermind of one of the most daring, remarkable crimes in history. To say that D.B. Cooper has a cult following really puts it mildly. There are clubs and conferences and conventions. You can buy D.B. Cooper material off of Amazon, T-shirts, coffee cups, you name it. And there's definitely a whole cult following. And there are many people that admire what he did. I saw an interview with a young man who said, yeah, he's a hero in my eyes because he got away with an incredible crime. He was extremely smart in the way he did it, and he didn't hurt anybody. That part of it is debatable. Anyone who's investigated criminal acts of this nature will tell you that the victims, the flight attendants, the crew, the pilots, were probably terrified. They were probably thinking about their last moments on Earth, that this guy could conceivably blow up the airplane and kill them all. But that's not really the purpose of this discussion. What I wanted to talk about was that clip-on tie and those two parachutes that were left on board after Cooper exited the airplane. They were examined for particles, and I believe they did find some interesting particles that led them to a certain suspect, I believe, who worked for the railway. However, you have to remember this was 1971. We never heard of DNA until about the mid-1980s, and they weren't used in criminal investigations until about 1986, 1987 in this country. My point here is that had we had DNA technology at the time, we could have easily gotten DNA off the clip-on tie, off the parachutes, off the seat where he was sitting during the flight, and used that material to compare against suspects that were developed in the investigation. In truth, that would have made pretty easy work of it. The other aspect of this involves the procedures of airline travel back in 1971. It was ridiculously easy to get on an airplane back then. You walked into the airport with cash if you wanted to. You bought a ticket. You told them your name. You didn't have to show identification. And you got on the plane. Things were very, very different then. There was no type of security or anti-terrorist measures existing at airports as they do today. So you could fly almost anonymously. So we don't know who Dan Cooper is, what his real name might have been. There's been speculation for decades upon decades about various suspects, and I'm not going to go into detail here about who they are. But there are some interesting books and documentaries and articles, hundreds, if not thousands of them, written about the subject. But my main point here was to compare the forensic aspects of the investigation to today's world. I have not studied the intricacies of the evidence that was left on the airplane, where it went in the FBI lab, or who handled it, but I would only assume that it's been handled by so many people and tested for various things that it's been degraded to the point where no DNA material at this point, 51 years later, can be recovered. And it wouldn't be the 51 years necessarily, but the handling and perhaps mishandling of the evidence, and we probably have an absence of evidence because otherwise we would be able to get a DNA profile, even after 51 years. I had a case once, and this is kind of branching off a little bit, but just to give you an example of how long DNA will last, we had a murder case up in Miami Springs back in 1987. A man was beaten to death in a motel room, and we had 4 empty beer cans found on the scene. At the time, we weren't using DNA. DNA was still a couple of years away from when we first started using it. I think I might have mentioned earlier that 1986, 1987 was when it was first used, but that was in England. And it was being used in paternity lawsuits, immigration cases, and things like that. And it wasn't used in an actual criminal case until later. I believe it was around 1988, when the murders of 2 young girls in a small town in England. And this scientist who had discovered DNA was able to assist and help solve the case. Fascinating story, by the way, if you ever get to read a book by Joseph Wambaugh called The Blooding. This chronicles those 2 murders and the ensuing investigations and how DNA was actually used to solve a criminal case for the first time. Anyway, this case we had in Miami Springs, there was a lot of blood on the scene. We had the 4 beer cans, and we didn't have any suspects. So we impounded all the evidence, and much later, much later, 17 years later, in fact, we got a grant from the federal government to start working old cases and running them through DNA. And so our lab was very busy reworking these old cases using DNA technology. Amazingly, we got a DNA profile off of the rim of one of the beer cans. These beer cans had been sitting in a plastic bag on some shelf in a remote corner of our property bureau, untouched. It had been holding the secret to the case the whole time. We entered the DNA profile into CODIS, which is the nationwide index, very much like the APHIS fingerprint system, connects and combines all of the DNA profiles taken from criminal suspects around the country. It took a year for this to run through the backlogged data, but we were able to identify a subject who had been arrested for multiple burglaries up in Illinois, and we had identified at least the guy who was on the scene and had at some point placed his DNA on the rim of those beer cans. So that was a pretty exciting time and was the oldest known case that I'm aware of in our police department that we were able to solve using DNA technology. So it's unfortunate that we didn't understand how to preserve evidence for DNA. Why would we? Back in 1971, no one had any clue what that was all about. If it didn't have blood on it and they weren't able to get fingerprints off of it, it was pretty much considered useless evidence in terms of forensic value. But the story of D.B. Cooper remains. It's still one of the greatest mysteries of our time, and without question, one of the most talked about crimes ever. There are still investigations, not official ones, but private investigations that are trying to get to the bottom of the D.B. Cooper mystery. One of the documentaries I saw, a commentator made an important point. He talked about one of the dangers is something called confirmation bias. And what that is when you have a strong suspect and things are pointing in the right direction, and this happens frequently, it's very easy to fall in love with the idea that you've, quote unquote, got the right guy. And it's a pitfall of any investigator who has worked for a long time on a case and is just thirsting to resolve it. The team of investigators who were in this documentary had developed a suspect who looked pretty good, but nothing to this day has ever been proven in regards to the identity of D.B. Cooper. So I bring this up for some of you who are in the investigative business, some of you who are learning the investigative business, and that is beware of confirmation bias. Remember that evidence and corroborative evidence rule the day when it comes to proving whether something is true or not. Well, that's about it for this episode. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for coming back. Just a reminder, if you're interested in developing your skills as an investigator, please pick up my book, The 10 Must-Haves to be a Great Detective. It's on Amazon as an e-Kindle book, or you can buy it in paperback. Many thanks once again for being here and for listening. And remember to always put your best foot forward, but don't forget to work on your other foot. Take care, and we'll see you next time.